Hello and welcome back to Cedra Summary. The Garden of Eden follows immediately upon the account of creation. Its characters are unforgettable. There is, of course, God and Adam, whom we have met already, but also we meet Adam's wife, Eve, and the talking and thinking and calculating serpent. There are two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And, of course, there's the fruit. So, let us make their acquaintance. When the eternal God created heaven and earth, there were not yet plants in the earth, and herbs of the field had not sprouted, because the eternal God had not brought rain upon the land, and there was no man to work it. Only a mist from the ground watered the earth. The eternal God formed the man, dust from the earth, and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, so that the man became a living being. The eternal God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and placed the man there. The eternal God brought up from the ground in the garden every beautiful tree with good food, including the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. From Eden there flows a river, which waters the garden. The eternal God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to work it and to care for it. He permitted the man to eat from any of the trees except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For God said, "On the day that you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die." The eternal God also determined that it was not good for the man to be alone, so he would make for him a helpmate. The eternal God formed from the ground every animal of earth and sky, and allowed the man to provide names for them. Although the man found names for all of them, he did not find a helpmate among them. So the eternal God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and took one of his ribs to form a woman from it. This time the man recognized it as bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and named her woman, derived from the word for man. So when a man leaves his father and mother, he joins with a woman as one flesh. Even though both of them were naked, they felt no shame. Now enter the serpent, the most precocious of all the animals of the field which the eternal God had made. He questioned the woman. Did God really say that you should not eat the fruit of any tree in the garden? The woman responded that God had prohibited eating only from a certain one of the trees in the midst of the garden, and from any contact with it, on pain of death. You won't die, said the serpent. And God knows, he said,
that when you eat from that tree, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings, knowing good and evil.
The woman also found the tree attractive and appetizing, and its fruit appealing as a means to knowledge. So she ate some of it and shared it with her man. Their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves to wear as garments. In fear, they hid from the eternal God's presence among the trees of the garden. When the eternal God questioned the man, he explained that he had hidden because he was naked. The eternal God asked him who told him he was naked and whether he had eaten from the forbidden tree, whereupon the man disclosed how the woman whom you placed with me had given him some of its fruit, and he had eaten. The woman, for her part, blamed the serpent for duping her. In response, the eternal God attached to the serpent the curse of crawling on its belly and eating the dust, as well as enmity between it and womankind. To the woman he attached the curse of pain in childbirth and her domination by her man. Because of the man Adam, he cursed the earth, and thereby Adam himself, with the arduous toil that would be required for its production of food. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, God said, until you return to the ground from which you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust shall you return. The man named his wife Eve, life, as she was the mother of all that lives. The eternal God provided them with clothing made from skin. Now the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, said the eternal God. So he removed him from the Garden of Eden, lest he eat also from the tree of life and live forever. He would instead work the land from which he had been taken, and the way to the tree of life would be guarded east of the Garden of Eden by the cherubim and a moving sword-like flame. So God created all of the trees and the plants in the Garden of Eden. They were watered, and the life of Adam and Eve would seem to be simple and pleasant. There was one limitation. God forbade the man from eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Presumably, Adam and Eve could eat from the tree of life, and the story implies that at that point they enjoyed eternal life. But then the serpent came along and provoked Eve by asking her a red herring kind of question. Did God really tell you that you should not eat the fruit of any tree in the garden? Eve, of course, hastened to respond to the serpent by telling him, no, that's not true. God said we could eat of any tree in the garden. Only one tree we could not eat of, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we can't eat of it, nor can we touch it. She added something that wasn't really in the prohibition that God had laid down. He said, do not eat from it, but he didn't say, do not touch it. So the rabbis make note of these discrepancies and try to understand what Eve's intention was. Perhaps they're also knowingly reading into Eve's answer something that was actually part of the legal culture of the rabbis, and that is to add prohibitions, which were not the original prohibitions in the Torah, in order to build a fence around the Torah. That is to say, in order to prevent people from violating the actual Torah law. So in this case, by protecting the prohibition of not eating from the tree of knowledge, they assumed that perhaps Eve was adding an additional non-Torah-based prohibition or non-God-based prohibition, that you should not touch it, so that if we learn to refrain from touching it, then we, of course, won't be able to eat it. Whereas if we were allowed to touch it, which is apparently the allowance that God had permitted, then there's a danger of eating it. But the rabbis go on to recognize that even though this appears to be a kind of rabbinic type of prohibition, which is called a gezerah, an enactment by human beings in order to protect the divine law, they also recognized that in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, there is a verse, chapter 30, verse 6 of Proverbs, add not to God's words, lest you be found untrue. So from that perspective, instead of making a protective fence for the Torah, Eve created an untrue situation. She actually, in a way, instead of building a fence around the Torah, she actually laid a siege against it. And so this is what the serpent then took advantage of, knowing that the divine prohibition was not against touching the tree. In order to get Eve into trouble, when the serpent saw her walking past the tree, what did he do? He pushed her into it and said to her, see, you've touched the tree and you haven't died. So you should feel free to eat from it. You won't die if you eat from it either. A midrash like this is in the category of rabbinic agadah. Agadah is the body of lore and thinking about the Torah, the implications, the conflicts, in contradistinction with halacha, which is the law. The law needs to be precise in order to advise people what they should or should not do, and it needs to protect what the laws of the Torah are. In the Agadah, in our example, we have the opportunity to think about the possible conflicts that might exist between two approaches to protecting the halacha. The one approach, make a fence about the Torah, add prohibitions in order to protect the real divine prohibition, or not to add prohibitions which might obliterate the boundary that a person really does need to observe between his or her acts and the prohibited law. of the Torah, which is the right approach. Well, the rabbis in each particular case might have decided it for the halacha, but the Agadah brings up the inherent paradox that the rabbis would always have to struggle with, and which we, as living human beings, also have to confront. Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote an essay which has become famous. The title of the essay, which, as you can see, would certainly apply to our discussion, is Halacha and Agadah. His opening lines: Halacha wears a frown, Agadah a smile. Halacha is pedantic, severe, unbending, all justice. Agadah is accommodating, lenient, pliable, all mercy. Halacha commands and knows no halfway house. Its yes is yes, and its no is no. Agadah advises and takes account of human limitation. It admits something between yes and no. On the one side, that would be the halacha side, is the dryness of prose, a formal and heavy style, a gray and monochrome diction. Reason is sovereign. On the Agadah side is the sap of poetry, a style full of life and variety, a diction all ablaze with color. Emotion is sovereign. As a child, Bialik was trained in halacha. As an adult, he was a poet. It is interesting and challenging to characterize halacha and agadah on the respective sides with these contrasts. And he gives more than I have read, and he also admits that even more could be attributed. But his thesis is that Judaism lives with both. It struggles with both. And it seems to me that our Agadah, the question of whether to build a fence around the Torah or not to build a fence around the Torah in order not to obliterate the garden of the mitzvah, the commandment itself, is in itself a study of both halacha and agadah. These are questions that very serious scholars and poets, or both, have confronted and entertained. And it may well be that the verdict is that Jews need to be engaging in a struggle between the place of each of them. The eternal God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to work it and to care for it. According to the Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, since a river flowed from Eden which watered the garden, and God planted trees to grow on their own, the only work for the man was the work of Torah, and the only thing for him to care for was the way to the tree of life. Here, the rabbis are connecting the tree of life with Torah, as they interpreted the famous verses from chapter 3 of the book of Proverbs. It is a tree of life to them who hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all of its paths are shalom, peace, well-being. What is the it? According to the rabbis, Torah. Torah is a tree of life. But let us not forget that the it to which these verses refer in context in chapter 3 of the book of Proverbs is not explicitly Torah, but Chokhmah, generic wisdom, possibly even akin to the knowledge that was provided by the other tree in the Garden of Eden, whose forbidden fruit Eve and Adam tasted. The book of Proverbs idealizes that kind of generic knowledge, while the rabbis idealize Torah. So, according to our Midrash, Adam's first job was to cultivate Torah. And if we stay on that thesis, then, when man and woman consume generic wisdom from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they are made like divine beings, and they forfeit access to Torah, which God had originally planned for them. This seems to be the revised blueprint for humanity from the expulsion from Eden until the time of Abraham in part, and then Moses in full. Knowledge of good and evil can be ascertained by individuals, and all of humanity is held responsible for its actions through human reason, that is, wisdom. But what distinguishes Abraham and Moses in God's eyes later is the element of chesed, mercy, compassion, which they exhibit, and which makes them worthy as bearers of the Torah, the tree of life. The meaning of this double path is worthy of consideration. The double path through both of the trees in the center of the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge, wisdom, and the tree of life, Torah. Do they respectively correspond with dichotomies of justice? That would be the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and mercy, which would be the tree of life, Torah, or the dichotomies of reason and revelation, or of universality and particularity, or something different. For now, at least, we are given access to one and denial of the other. And by following the course of humanity as it steps out of the Garden of Eden, we shall learn things that apply to all peoples and cultures.
Torah no, no, no.